Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some colorful Easter cards that shimmer. I'm using the new Happy Spring collection from Simon Hurley and Spellbinders. This here is the Bunny Buddies die set. Then we have the beautiful In Bloom egg die set. And I'll be using that to create two egg-shaped cards with totally different techniques. Then we have the Ornate Eggs embossing folder, some beautiful embossed eggs created with that, as well as the Ornate Eggs layering stencil set. So I'm going to start off with the layering stencil set as well as the embossing folder. Now both of these are nice and large. They're 5.5 by 8.5 inches, so you could create two card fronts at the same time with this. There's 5 different layers to those eggs for that layering stencil set. I'm going to first start off with embossing a piece of cardstock, and I want to create 2 card fronts. So I have a piece of cardstock here that's 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches. It's Hammermill Cardstock. I plan on doing some ink blending on it, and I really love ink blending on Hammermill Cardstock. It's also nice and easy to emboss. I'm using the 3D embossing folder, stacking on my die cutting machine. This is a Platinum 6, so it lists right on the plates exactly what the stacking is, which I absolutely love. So here is the embossed cardstock, and this is just white cardstock, but you get a lot of fun detail with those eggs and that embossing folder. Now, the one thing that is really interesting that I learned, I assumed that the pattern part of the layering stencil set was going to have exactly the same pattern as the embossing folder for those eggs, but it absolutely doesn't. So you'll see me here, I'm confused a little bit because the pattern for that pattern part of the embossing folder, because there's a certain technique that I wanted to do, doesn't match those eggs. So what you're seeing here is me totally confused about that. And then I decide to change the way I'm going to do the technique. Now, typically I like to stencil first and then emboss because I like stenciling on flat cardstock. Here I decided that I was going to emboss first and then stencil because sometimes when you stencil first and then emboss, the paper moves in the embossing folder as it's stretched and embossed, and then you get at the end of the cardstock, the pattern isn't lined up. So I put that embossed piece to the side. I'll pull it back in just a moment. I have a flat piece of Hammermill cardstock here. Now I want to do my ink blending for a lot of these cards with some color shift pads. Color shift pads are very similar to the interference pads that I love to use. However, the ink is creamier. They're better for blending 2 colors together. Now, one of the techniques that I love doing with my interference pads is using a black ink and then using my interference colors over top of it. Both the color shift and the interference pads have one look on white or light cardstock and a completely different look on black or dark cardstock. So I love playing with those properties. Now, the color shift pads, because they're a creamier ink, they stay wet longer. When I do that technique with the interference pads, I'll typically use a black memento pad or my black soot distress pad. It's just a dye-based ink, and it works perfectly. However, it doesn't work as well with the color shift pads because they're creamier, because they stay wet a little bit longer. I find that black ink runs and moves. So here I'm using some black StazOn ink for that part of the technique. The one thing though is you want to make sure to clean off your stencil really, really well. So I'm using some Ultra Clean in order to clean that ink off of my stencil. Now, if you've ever used Ultra Clean before, it kind of leaves a bit of an oily residue. So when you're using it for stencils as well as embossing folders, once I'm done cleaning all of that ink off with that Ultra Clean, I will go under a tap and use some hand soap or dish soap and remove any of that oily residue on there. I don't want to leave that on there and have it on there for the next time I plan on using this stencil. I always like to make sure that those type of things are off of there. You also don't want those oils on your fingers when you're working with your card making. So I cleaned that off screen, and now I'm ready to do the other 4 layers for this background. Now for the eggs, I wanted them to have 2 colors to each one. So I wanted, say, blue to green, blue to purple, or purple to pink. So I'm going to do each layer with a different combination of the inks. I have 4 different inks here that I'm using. The blue one there is Summer Sky, or Under the Sea. The green one is Summer Sky. I always get those 2 mixed up, and I'm not really totally sure why. So I have ink blending brushes for each one of them. I'll do a few eggs at a time. I don't want that ink to start drying on me. So it does stay wet for longer than the interference inks, but I don't want to leave it there to dry. So you'll see as I'm working through each layer, I'm doing 3, 4, 5 eggs at a time, and then I'm doing the second color of each one. So the top or the bottom of each egg will be one of the colors, and then the opposite side will be the other color. Now, when you're using interference or the color shift inks, like I said, they're a little bit creamier. Because of that, the shimmer isn't quite as prominent as they are with interference inks. This technique will also work with interference inks. However, when you blend interference inks into each other, it's a little bit harder to blend two colors into each other. I tend to play around with the pressure of my ink blending with my brush, as well as the ink that's on there. I'll start with lighter pressure, and as we work and there's less ink on there, I'll go with a heavier pressure just to kind of fake an ink blend. These are definitely a lot easier to ink blend, but the shimmer is a little bit more subtle. So just be prepared for that. They also have a little bit of a chalky look to them, which is perfect for eggs, in my opinion. The interference inks are a little bit more transparent. The colors are just a little bit brighter because they don't have that chalky finish to them. I love both of them. I tend to prefer the interference inks, especially if I'm just working with one or two colors at a time. I like the color shift for blending them together, but I really like the fact that the interference inks has much more shimmer to them. So I would play with both of them and see which one your preference is. I certainly prefer certain ones for certain things. When I'm doing something like this where I'm blending two colors together, these are definitely the easier choice. So that last combination I used was the blue pad, and then I combined it with Golden Heather. That was the purple one. Now I'm going to be doing the purple one with the pink one. So the pink one is Fruit Punch. The color shift pads come in 12 different colors. I chose colors here that I thought were nice and bright for spring. I wanted to have some nice, perfect colors for spring. So I chose this. Now, in full disclosure, by the time this background is done, it's too busy and too much color for me. I think it actually reminds me of tie-dye. I think for... I would have preferred it if instead of black, I had a gray StazOn for the bottom layer for that detail. I think the black is a little bit too bold for my personal taste. I'm not saying that it's not great or it's not nice and colorful, perfect for spring, but for what I had envisioned, it's just a little bit too bold. I'm going to do a second egg background with that embossed piece, and I'm going to do it in a little bit different way with the color shift inks by combining it with some distress inks, so you can see the difference between the two. The second one, in my opinion, is just a little bit calmer, but I always love playing with different techniques, playing with different ideas in my head, and sometimes they work out and sometimes they're just not quite the look that you had in your head. So once I have done this layer, I have one more layer to go. I'm going to combine that pink one with the green. So we're going to have combinations with all of those ink colors. I didn't want to pull in more ink colors. I thought the 4 different ones were enough. And the color blending goes really, really quite quick with them. Now, I've mentioned before in my color shift and interference videos, I have a brush for each one of these pads because each one has a different color for white or light and a different interference color to them. I don't like to mix them. You can clean your brushes off after your use. For me, what worked best was for each pad to have its own brush. I have a little label on the inside of the brush so I know exactly which brush is for which. That may not work for everyone, and some people might be comfortable to use the same brush with a few different color pads. I didn't really like that for my brain. That just didn't work for me. So this is what works for me. But like I said, you can clean your brushes off after you're done using them, and you can use them for other colors. However, personally, I don't mix my color shift ink pad brushes with my interference ink pad brushes or my metallic. Like I keep them, each one of them separate, because different inks have different properties to them and I don't want to contaminate my pads. So this is the finished result here. We have some bright, bold colored eggs there with that pattern from the pattern stencil that it was done in the black StazOn. So I'm going to set that to the side and I'm going to pull out that embossed background and I'm going to change up the ink blending for this one. So for this one, I'm not going to use the layer that had the patterns on it from the stencils. I'm only going to use the 4 layers with just the egg shapes on it. So I put my cardstock here, my embossed piece, on that sticky mat, and you may have noticed for the last one as well as this one, I'm using some painter's tape to hold that piece down. This stencil is just slightly bigger than the cardstock, and rather than worrying about it moving on me, I just tape it down with some painter's tape. I reuse that painter's tape for the whole project, and it just keeps it secure so I don't have to worry about it moving. For each one of these layers, I'm going to do one color per egg, and then I'm going to do the coordinating color shift ink pad color. I'm starting with the Distress ink. I wanted the color to be fairly light, so I'm using my large blending brushes with each one of those Distress inks. Then I'm going in with that color shift pad using the brush that goes with it. I'm tapping that ink onto my stencil so that I don't have too much ink on my brush before I do my ink blending. And then I'm only ink blending the bottom part of the egg. So we have a little bit of an ombre, but with just one color tone to it. When you do the ink blending on embossing, it brings out the detail of the embossing. And I like the fact that just the darker part of that egg has the darker color as well as that little bit of shimmer from the color shift pad. So this in the end is my preference over those two backgrounds. And I think it just depends on the color or the look that you're going for. I tend to prefer things that are a little bit simpler to a point. And when you see some of my things, that doesn't really make sense, but I kind of sometimes things are too busy. Anyways, so this is the first layer with those blues. The next layer is going to be pink. So I'm using some spun sugar, and then I'm using that fruit punch pad. Now the blue that I used was tumbled glass. And I chose the distress colors based on the color shift colors, and I just chose ones that were lighter in color, or lighter in color tone to those. I didn't want my background too bold or too bright. I wanted it to be a little bit more calm. So once again, I'm going first with the distress color, then I'm going in with the color shift color. Now the distress pads are dye-based pads. The color shift ones are hybrid pads. So they have dye properties to them, they have pigment properties to them. So you don't want to get the ink from the color shift pads on your distress ones. However, if there's a little bit of distress ink on my stencil and I go in and use my color shift brushes on them, I'm not going to do anything or contaminate my color shift pads at all. So that's why I'm doing the order that I'm doing. I also don't want to get the ink from the color shift inks onto my blending brushes for my distress inks, because those will contaminate those as well. But for each one of these layers, I go in with the distress ink first, then I go in with the color shift ink. And I'll tap that color shift brush onto my stencil, onto some of the solid parts of the stencil, so that I take some of that ink off first, so I have a little bit of control. Sometimes I'll go back into that ink to pick a little bit more of it up, but I want to make sure that I don't accidentally get too much ink on. It's much easier to add more ink if I don't have enough. You can't take ink away once it's on the paper there. So for the next layer here, I'm using shaded lilac distress ink with that golden heather color shift pad. So once again, going in with my large Spellbinders brush, doing the first layer for the eggs. Now, anytime I do stenciling or ink blending with my distress pads, I tend to do, it's not all even color tones. Some areas are lighter, some areas are darker. And I've mentioned this many times before. I just prefer the look when there's some areas that are lighter and some are darker. I think it looks a little bit more interesting. If you want them all to be the same heaviness or the same amount, you can absolutely do that. We're still going to get some heaviness when we go in with that color shift pad. Now I'm also going and just doing one side of the egg, and typically that's the bottom side of the egg. Another option here would be to go all the way around the egg, just so they have a little bit more visual dimension or roundness to them. That's another option there too. But I really love the look of some dark areas and some light areas on each one of them. So there's one more layer to go, and that's with the green pad. So I'm going to be using some Twisted Citron as well as that Summer Sky color shift pad. Now with the Twisted Citron, I didn't want the green to get too bright. So I'm going to tap it on my desk first to get some of the ink off my brush, so that I have control over how much ink I have on that brush. And if I want to add a little bit more color to it, I absolutely can, but I don't want to accidentally get too much of that green on there, because I think it could totally overpower the other colors in my background. Once I'm done that, I'm going in with that Summer Sky color shift pad, again doing the bottom side of each one of those eggs, tapping the brush off on my stencil to take off any excess ink. If I need to, I can pull the ink up off of that little bit of my stencil to get more ink onto my brush. Typically though, I'll go right back into my pad in order to do that, but you can really pull it off the stencil. It's not going to dry on the stencil. And the great thing with these color shift pads is they clean off the stencil with just water. I don't need any special cleaner or anything, or any soap or anything. I can just rinse them under the sink, and that water or that ink comes off totally. It's water soluble and water reactive, so we don't need anything special to clean off. So here is the finished stenciled and embossed background here. So you can see right away that this background, even though we've got some colorful eggs on there, it's not quite as busy as the other one is with the black part included. So we have some visual dimension to both of them because of the color combinations. The embossed one obviously has physical texture to it, but it's two different ways of using that combination, except the first one doesn't have the embossing to it or the embossing folder used on it. You could still use that embossing folder, but like I said, the pattern part of the stencil doesn't match the same pattern as the egg. So you can really have fun playing around with that. Now, this Bunny Buddies die set has some sentiments to it, but I wanted to have some stamp sentiments. So I'm using the clear stamp and die of the month from February 2026. This one's called Ears to Spring. It has some great sentiments for Easter cards and spring cards. So I just picked a few of them out. I have more than I need here. I'm going to stamp and emboss them with some gold embossing powder. So first I use some embossing powder tool on my cardstock. I'm just using Hammermill Cardstock here. And then I am stamping it a couple times with my Misty stamping tool to make sure that I get a nice crisp sentiment there. Pouring that embossing powder over top of it before using my heat tool to melt that powder. Now I chose this set because each one of these sentiments has a coordinating die to it. So I can die cut each one of those sentiments out for the front of my card. It's funny how before dies were a thing, fussy cutting was no big deal, but now that dies are a thing, I definitely prefer die cut sentiments over fussy cut ones. So I chose this mainly for that, because you could fussy cut or you could die cut them and have some really nice looking sentiments for the front of the card. And I did that heat embossing because I like the look, the extra look of having that dimension from the embossing with those sentiments. You could easily, if you want, if you prefer, you could use a gold pad or whatever color pad you choose. You wouldn't have that embossed texture to it, but you could still get some sentiments perfect for those cards there. So with those sentiments done, I can set those off to the side. And the first thing I'm going to do is use those two egg backgrounds to create some simple cards, but they're going to have lots of color to them because of that ink blending and because of that color shift ink. It's going to have some beautiful shimmer to it as well. So the first card is going to be created with that first background using that black StazOn ink for the pattern as well as the color shift ink on top of it. I trimmed my egg patterned piece down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and then I trimmed a piece of black cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, putting them onto an A2 card base. I'm going to glue those both to that card base and then add the sentiment. So again, super simple card, but it has a lot of color to it as well as that beautiful shimmer from the color shift inks. Now, and for this particular card, I left my sentiment with just the white cardstock with the embossing on it. However, you could use one of those color shift pads and ink blend over top of it if you wanted it to be a bit more prominent and stick out a little bit more. I will do that for another card in order to have that sentiment pop out a little bit more, but I chose to leave it white with this one because there's a lot going on here. I didn't want to add more to it, but I did want to add just a little bit of sparkle and texture. So I'm using some stickles on here. This is Stardust stickle, so it doesn't have any color to it. It has some opalescent glitter that is going to dry. It's going to add that sparkle because of that glitter, but we're still going to be able to see all of the color underneath there. And I'm following the different patterns that were created with that black StazOn through that pattern stencil in order to put that pattern on the eggs. Another option here would be to say use a Stardust gel pen, which has some shimmer to it. It wouldn't have the texture to it that the stickles gives it, but it would also give a little bit of shimmer. It would be a bit more subtle. And then the third option would be to cover each one of these eggs with, say, some glossy accents. I would do this before the card was created and then let it completely dry. But then you would have egg shapes that are nice and glossy that have that color shift underneath them, as well as the pattern underneath there. So that is the first card. I set that over to the side for those stickles to dry while I'm creating some more cards. I grabbed my embossed and stenciled background, trim that to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And then I'm going to take just a plain piece of Hammermill cardstock and trim that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. One of the things that I love to do with both the interference pads as well as the color shift pads is use those pads to color my mat for my card. This way I get the exact color that I used on part of that card, as well as I get that little bit of shimmer there. I use that with the edge of the pad. Now, if you're looking for more ideas for using the color shift pads as well as the interference pads, I have playlist for both of them, and they have all of the videos that I've used either one of these pads in. So it's a great way to find more ideas for it. So I used that same color that I used for the matte there, that was the Fruit Punch, and I used my ink blending brush with it to ink blend the sentiment for this card. So this way that sentiment is going to be popped off that card. Now the way I chose the color for this was I kind of paid attention to where I was going to put the sentiment, and where I was going to put the sentiment there wasn't a pink egg, so I could do that pink color and it was going to pop off where those eggs were, as well as it was going to frame it nicely with that the color of the color shift for that matte. If by chance there was a pink egg there, I would have just picked one of the colors that didn't have one of those, or that wasn't that color egg for that particular area, because I want that sentiment to pop off. I want it to be a little bit more prominent. Because these eggs aren't quite as busy as the last one, I don't mind adding a little bit of attention to that sentiment. So with that card done, we're going to pull out the Bunny Buddies die set. I have all of my pieces die cut. I'm going to use that second background with the embossed as well as the stenciled eggs for a nice colorful background for this, but we're going to have to put our pieces together first. The other way I added texture to this was I die cut my bunny out of some velvet adhesive cardstock. This comes in a bunch of different colors. It comes in an assortment, and I love using it for animal die cuts because it adds that extra little bit of texture to it that you're not necessarily expecting. Now this has adhesive on the back of it. I like to put it onto some cardstock before die cutting because it adds, or it gives it just a little bit of stability when you're die cutting, as well as that way you have that cardstock on the back for gluing things down. You could just use the adhesive to it, but when you're putting a bunch of different pieces together, I just like that cardstock background to it. It die cuts just like regular cardstock, so you don't need to do anything special with it. I just treat it exactly like cardstock and it die cuts absolutely beautifully, but it adds that extra fuzzy texture. So my bunny is going to be fuzzy on the front of my card. The rest of the pieces are going to be plain cardstock, and it just adds something that gives it a bit of a wow factor to it. And I always love things that have a combination of different textures to it. So the one thing to note with that velvet cardstock though is it's going to take just a little bit longer to dry. I like to use a liquid adhesive for gluing all of my pieces together as well as my cards. I use it for 90-95% of the things that I put together. With cardstock, you don't really need to wait too long for that card or for that glue to start to grab, but with the velvet adhesive or the velvet cardstock, it does start to soak into the velvet first and then the glue starts to set. So I do give it a little bit longer for drying time. For my die cut pieces here, I'm going to use those color shift inks just to give them a little bit of shimmer. It's not going to give them any or much extra color, but it is going to make those die cuts have that shimmer properties. It's going to coordinate with the eggs on the background of my cards. So I have the Fruit Punch here that I'm putting on the pink. I have the Under the Sea that I'm putting on the blue. And then I pulled out the Peanut Glow one. This is for these yellow die cut pieces. I didn't think any of the other colors that I already had out would be good for them. So I pulled out that one because I didn't want the yellow pieces to not have any shimmer to them. I also put a little bit of the Summer Sky on the grass. However, the grass is die cut from Rainforest Cardstock, and it's pretty much the same color tone as that color shift pad, so you really don't see what's on there. And those pieces are so tiny that you don't really see a whole lot of that shimmer either. For this large egg here, I have the base piece die cut out of the Wildberry cardstock before ink blending, and then the upper layer die cut out of Breeze cardstock with that Under the Sea interference or color shift ink on top of it. So I glued those together, put an acrylic block on top of there to hold them in place while everything is drying. And then there's another die in this set that has a cluster of 3 eggs and then a single egg. So I die cut them out of the blue cardstock, the Wildberry cardstock, as well as some Beeswax cardstock. And I'm gluing the single egg in the middle of a cluster that's completely different so that we have clusters of different colored eggs. I'm going to create a bit of a scene on the front of this card. So these are going to be pieces that just fill in that scene. And then the other pieces that I have that I ink blended there are some flowers. I have the stems die cut. I didn't do any ink blending on those stems, but I'm going to glue those to the cards, and then I'm going to glue the flowers on after those stems are glued to the cards because I want to make sure to spread out the different colors that I have for my flowers there. Just like my last cards, I took my egg background and I trimmed that to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Then I took a plain piece of Hammermill cardstock and trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. Now I'm going to use that Summer Sky color shift pad, and I'm going to ink blend around or put the ink around my mat there so that it matches my die cuts as well as my background. Another option, because we have a bunch of colored cardstock here, another option would be to just use colored cardstock for that mat as well. Either one of those will work for this particular card. I'm going to glue that piece onto the card and then glue my egg piece on top of it. And then I'm going to create the scene. And I want my bunny to be towards the center. I want to have the grass around him as well as the flowers and then some eggs in the grass. I have the Happy Easter sentiment that is die cut. That's from this particular set. So there's the Happy Spring as well as Happy Easter sentiment that can be inserted into that banner, so you can pick and choose which sentiment you want. And then you can also die cut that banner in a solid color so that you have a solid color underneath there. So once I have my banner at the top there, I glue the bunny, and because of that liquid glue, because it's not going to set super quickly, I have some time to be tucking things in behind him. So I'll focus on what I want to tuck in behind him as I'm working, and that way the glue can start to set while those things are happening. Once I have everything together, I'll put my acrylic block on there to hold everything in place and let that glue dry. But I have the grass here. Then I'm going to put those stems for the flowers on there. And then I'm also going to put those little clusters of eggs. The final thing I'm going to put on there is the flowers. And I have them die cut out of the Wildberry cardstock that has the color shift ink on it, the Beeswax cardstock that has color shift ink on it. And then I also have some die cut out of some blush cardstock, which is a light pink. Now, like I said before, I'm putting the flowers on afterwards because I want to intermix those the flower colors, and I want to make sure that I don't have a cluster of Wildberry altogether or the yellow altogether. I want to make sure that they're kind of scattered around, kind of similar to the way that eggs are different colors and scattered all around that background. So I just like the look of that. Another option here would be to use exactly the same color for all of those flowers as well. Now, because I'm using that liquid glue, this works for all of these different sizes of die cuts. Makes it really easy to glue them down, but give you that little bit of wiggle room to move and shimmy things in place. And when I die cut pieces like this, I often have extras. I like to have more die cuts than I think I'm going to need, because sometimes I change my mind as to where I'm going to place things as I'm doing them. And I like to have the flexibility to do that and not have to stop and do some more die cutting. So in the end, I end up having some extra of the stems. I'll just put them in a little Ziploc bag and I will save them for a future project, so they're not going to go to waste. So the last step here is to add those flowers. I'm just going to put a dot in the center of the flower shadow part on each one of those stems. And then I'm just going to match up the flower with the shape of it. And it's really easy to do that. So the one thing that I love doing when using die cut flowers is sometimes you'll get centers that you can die cut out of them. I like to put dots of stickles in there. It gives that extra little bit of dimension. It gives it that extra little bit of sparkle. Most of the time I'll use Stardust so that we don't add any extra color. You can use a different color of stickles. Another option would be to something like liquid pearls or Nouveau drops. It just adds a different texture to the center of the flower. These ones are so tiny, and because there's so much texture in the rest of the card, I don't really want to add, or so much color in the rest of the card, I don't really want to add more color. So I'm going to just do those stickles just in the center of the flower and then let that dry. And they're just dots, so really 15 minutes or so, and those should be dry. But we have a card here that has a ton of texture between that stenciled and embossed background and all of those die cuts, and then the velvet cardstock for the bunny. Next, I'm going to be using the In Bloom egg die set. This has two pieces to it. It has that outer egg piece as well as the inner egg pattern piece. I'm going to use some Sizzix permanent adhesive sheets on my cardstock before die cutting. Now, after the fact, I thought of an easier way to do this. So what I would do in hindsight for my next time is I would take this piece of cardstock here and I would die cut it the outer egg shape and use this as the front of the card to put those pieces on. And then I would die cut just plain cardstock so that I could easily ink blend them. And you'll see why I'm saying this in just a moment. I have two egg die cuts to the top right of my screen there for my card base. So what I like to do is have two pieces for my card base and then create a separate one for gluing right onto that card front. So after I've put that Sizzix adhesive sheet onto my cardstock here, I am putting these dies on the cardstock side of that piece of cardstock there, and I will be die cutting it in just a moment. I'm just going to do my egg card base before, so I can have that drying while I'm doing the front of it. Now, the first thing I do is just use my trimmer to just slice right off the bottom of that egg, just a tiny little bit to give it a bit more of a straighter edge because the egg has a curved shape to it. This is just going to give it a little bit more stability when standing. Then I use my score pal and score it at about 4.5 inches and fold that score line to make sure that I've got a good hinge on it, and then put some glue on that top part and then glue those two pieces together, set it aside to totally dry. Next, I'm going to take that piece that I have the StazOn adhesive sheet on. I'm going to die cut that, and I'm die cutting it with the blade side up so that it has a little bit more pressure to it. I want to make sure to die cut all the way around that egg. I also want to use all of those pieces as stickers. I'm going to do a little bit of inlay here, but I used white cardstock so that I can do some ink blending on them. I just like the look of the ink blending because it has some color variation to it. If you want solid colors, solid cardstock would be the choice here. Now, some of these are going to come off with the backing from the StazOn adhesive sheet. Some of them are going to come off just like stickers because the die didn't cut all the way through the backing. And this is where I'm saying if the front of the card has that adhesive on it, you don't die cut through that other than the outside of the egg shape. This would just be cardstock that doesn't have adhesive on it. It would make it a little bit easier because I could use my sticky mat for doing all of my ink blending, and it would just make it go a little bit more smooth. So when you see that I have some pieces on the sticky mat, those are ones that have the backing still on it. The ones that I'm putting on my tape backing sheet to the right here are ones that are coming off as stickers. The backing is staying in that die cut. So I'm doing a little bit of ink blending on them on that adhesive piece there. I run out of space though, so I end up using my sticky mat. The base or my work surface here is covered with a Tim Holtz media mat, so those stickers will stick to it, and I can do my ink blending on there. However, I don't push those stickers down too much, so when I start to do my ink blending, they move around, and as soon as you get a little bit of ink on that background, they don't want to really stick onto that media mat. And again, this is where just die cutting it, just having plain cardstock shaped pieces would be easier because I could do it all on my sticky mat. So as you see these things moving around while I'm doing my ink blending, just know that that wouldn't happen if they were just cardstock pieces and they were just on my sticky mat. So I start with my ink blending with my distress pad. I'm using the Twisted Citron pad. And then I'm going to go in with the color shift pad just to add a little bit of darkness to those colors as well as that little bit of shimmer. So again, using the two separate brushes with those so I'm not contaminating my pads. I'm going to do the greens first, and then I'm going to make my flowers pink for this card. You could also do the purples with the golden heather and the shaded lilac. I'm going to do this same style-ish look of card, but a completely different technique. And for that one, I'm going to have the flowers purple. So I wanted them to be pink for this. So for the flowers here, I'm using that Spun Sugar Distress Pad. Then I'm going to go in with that Fruit Punch Color Shift Pad and just add some darker color to the center of those flowers and that shimmer from the Color Shift Pad. Now you can see when I'm doing my ink blending, I'm doing it super quick. In my opinion, it doesn't need to be absolutely perfect ink blending. I just want color variation here. We have a whole egg that has these colored pieces in there. So in my opinion, the whole part of it is going to detract from anything being not absolutely perfect. I'm moving my pieces to the side because the other thing I want to do is do some ink blending on my egg here. So I start with my Tumble Glass Distress Pad, doing a little bit of ink blending around the edges. I want the edges of the egg to be darker. Then I do a little bit with whatever ink is left on the brush in the center of that egg, just to give it a little bit of a blue tone. I don't want my egg to be completely blue. You could make it darker color if you want. And again, if you were doing solid colors for your flowers, you could also do a solid color blue for your egg, or whatever color you want your egg to be. I think it could be like a pale yellow or even a brown. You could do it so many different colors. Because it's Easter, you can have a lot of fun with it. Then I go in with the Under the Sea Color Shift Pad and do a little bit of darker ink blending around the outside edges. giving it that shadow to it as well as that little bit of shimmer around it. And once we're done that ink blending, we're ready to start assembling our card. Now, because most of these pieces still have the backing on them, those you would need to pull the backing off, peel the backing off before gluing it to your card base. The ones that the backing has already come off are already stickers. So again, this is where having a solid piece on the card base would make it easier, because you would pull that backing off that card base, put the outline piece of your egg on there, and then just inlay all of these pieces. And most of them are really easy to inlay. The StazOn adhesive sheets, they're permanent. However, you have a little bit of wiggle room. So you'll see that I'll put them in a wrong spot, or I'll put them in and I'll turn them around until they actually match, because the flowers are not completely symmetrical. But I can lift them up. If I have them in a wrong spot, I can lift them up and I can move them. So they're not immediately permanent. They have a little bit of forgiveness to them. This is the easiest way to do inlay. Rather than putting glue on the outside part of that egg, then putting glue on each and every single one of these pieces, having them as stickers or having the adhesive already in the sheet form between them makes it so much easier. So as I'm going, I'm inlaying each one of these pieces. I realized after putting a couple flowers in that I might as well put all of my leaves in. They're a little bit easier to know exactly which piece goes where. So I put all of those in, and then I continue on with those flowers. Now those flowers each had a completely separate piece for the center of them. I ignored those pieces. I'm going to be using some gems for the center of the flowers. And then there's also little tiny dots on the egg that I also ignored. I'm going to put smaller gems in those areas. So those are going to be completely filled. Another option for either one of them would be to put the stickles in there if you want to have a little bit of glitter or shimmer, but I really love the look that the gems give them. So once I have all of my leaf pieces in there, I'm going to start to inlay the rest of the flowers. And this is where you can see that it's fairly easy to know which flower goes where. However, you'll see that I will turn some around and we'll need to move things in place. And here's where I put the wrong one in that other hole there, but I can easily lift it back up. I'm not ruining the adhesive in any way. It's easy enough to lift it off. It has enough forgiveness to it that I can lift it off, put it in the right spot, and then put the right flower where it goes. So I love the fact that these are not completely permanent right away. It gives you that little bit of wiggle room to it. Now it looks like I'm confused as I'm doing it. These smaller flowers all kind of look the same. However, they each go in a spot. Another option here would be, as you're taking them out of the piece at the beginning before doing the ink blending, to make sure to leave them in some sort of order so you know exactly where each one goes, and that would avoid this confusion here. But it's really not that hard. It's harder to me, in my opinion, to watch it than it was to figure out where each one goes. It's kind of like a puzzle. You have to sometimes put things in the wrong spot before figuring out exactly where the right spot goes. But I love the look of this. I think having the white cardstock that is ink blended gives it a softer, more interesting look than it would have if it's colored, like solid colored cardstock. Another option would be solid colored cardstock that are pastels, and then doing just a little bit of ink blending to darken those pieces. So there's so many different ways that you can create variations of this. Now the gems that I'm going to be using for this are the Spellbinders Essential Gems. I have Aura ones here which have a gold tone to them. I'm going to put those in the center of the flowers. I thought they'd be a great pop of color in the center of the flowers. And then I also have some Spectrum ones. And those Spectrum ones kind of have a little bit, they're kind of iridescent, but have a little bit of a pinky purpley tone to them. Those holes or the dots in the egg background are really, really tiny ones. So it's only going to use the tiniest of the gems. So I'm going to be using the tiny Spectrum ones for that. I didn't really need a pop of color for those, but I did want to fill in those areas because those are open holes. Any of those pieces that didn't come out when I was doing my ink blending, I just used the pick part from my tool-in-one to pop them out so that I had those open holes to put those gems in. So we're not adding a whole lot of dimension, but it really does give both the background as well as those flowers some beautiful sparkle from those gems. And they have adhesive on the back of them already, so it makes them really easy to use. And I use my tool-in-one here to pierce into that adhesive behind them and hold them right on the end of that tool. Then I use my left pointer finger just to push that down right into the hole and have that adhesive have some contact. Now, after doing this to the background of the card, really all of this card needs is a sentiment on it. So you could use one of those stamped and embossed sentiments, or you can use the sentiment from the Bunny Buddies set and have a die cut sentiment on the front of it. You could even just put the sentiment on the inside of the card, but I think it's absolutely beautiful. And I think it would be gorgeous just standing, say, on a mantle for display, because it really is, it's just pretty. It's just so pretty. You could also take this piece and put it on the front of the card, but you know, shaped cards, they're not that hard to do, but it gives it a unique look to it. So that card is nearly done, but I am going to take the sentiment from that Bunny Buddies set. I'm going to die cut those pieces, and then I'm going to ink blend them to match the colors of the flowers and whatnot on my card here. So just like the card base, I'm using white cardstock. And if you've never used any of these dies that have the inlay sentiments, this is how you do it. So I do one with the outline, just die cutting it as is so that I have the under piece. You could eliminate this piece and have the pattern from the egg underneath showing through the sentiment if you want. Then you pick which sentiment you are choosing. For this one, I chose the Happy Spring. Now, you could just die cut it without positioning it and taping it, but I don't want it to shift on me while I'm die cutting. I also want to make sure that that sentiment is centered. So I like to place it in there and use some Best Ever Craft tape in order to tape that in place so that I know it's not going to move on me. And that Best Ever Craft tape can be used multiple times. I just keep using it until it doesn't really stick. Then I use my pointer piece from that tool-in-one, the poker, and poke out all of those pieces from the sentiment so that I have a nice bright sentiment there. I used some of that Tumbled Glass Distress ink, and then I used the Under the Sea color shift pad just to go around the outside edges. Again, like I said, I am just coordinating with the base of the card. So I wanted to make sure that it's nice and vibrant. For the solid piece, I'm going to be using the Fruit Punch color shift pad. So it's going to have that beautiful shimmer to it as well as that bright color showing through each one of those letters. So I'll ink blend on that and then clean my pad or clean my sticky mat off, glue those two pieces together, and then that can go right onto the front of the card. Once I have it glued onto the front, I'll put my acrylic block on there just to hold it for a few minutes till that glue starts to set, and then our card is complete. And this, I have this done in greens, pinks, and blues, but you can easily change up the color palette in order to basically to your liking. So here is the finished card. Here you can see that it sits really nicely because we cut that tiny little bit off of the base of the card. We have a little bit of color variation from that ink blending and that sparkle from those gems. I really like how they just add and finish off those eggs, or that egg. Now, the last technique here, it's a little bit fiddly for one of the parts, but the result, in my opinion, is spectacular and has a great wow factor to it. This is one of my favorite techniques because I just love the finished result. So I'm going to start the same way I started with the last egg card. I'm going to create the base. So I just did a little slice off the bottom of the egg, scored at 4.5 inches, made sure I had a nice hinge on that back piece there, and then glued it to the front of the card. Now I have a piece of Hammermill cardstock that I've put some score tape on. This is a nice strong adhesive. It comes in many different widths, and I like to get it on the roll because it's the most economical way to get it. You can also get it by sheets if you're new to it. That is a great way to start to see if this is your cup of tea. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but again, I love it because I love the final result. So I'm going to tape those two dies together just like I did the sentiment for the last card using that Best Ever Craft tape. Then I'm going to put it right over top of my piece of cardstock with the score tape on it, making sure that that print side is up, my blade side is down. Now, really what I'm wanting to do here is just cut through the pattern of that die through the tape backing. I'm not interested in cutting all the way through. The only die that I'm interested in cutting all the way through is this egg outline die. So it didn't cut all the way through, so I'm going to do this one more time, but I don't need that inner part on there. So you can't tape these dies to the tape backing, it won't stick, but what I can do is tape this die around the outside of the cardstock onto the back. Now, when I'm putting this die back in, I'm making sure it's in the same channel that it was for the first pass. It's really easy to find. You just move the die on the cardstock and it just kind of falls into place. Once that is die cut, we're ready for the technique. Now this is the fiddly part of this technique. And again, it's got a great wow factor to it. It has a great result. So I have a piece of a pair of tweezers here. These have a fine point to them. These are the type of tweezers that you have to hold closed. If I release them, they open up. I'm holding the backing of this tape and I'm pulling out the leaf and the stem and the flower pieces. I'm not pulling off any of the tape for the background of the egg. And this is important. We want to take all of the pieces out for the flowers and for the leaves and stems. Now, an alternative to this would be to take just the pieces for the flowers out, use a colored glitter for the flowers, then take just the pieces for the leaves and stems and use a different color glitter for that, and then do color glitter on the back. I am using some transparent microfine glitter for all of this, and I'm going to color the glitter with Copic marker so that we have some color variation, very similar to how we have color variation when we do ink blending. Now, like I said, the most fiddly part of this is pulling out all of these pieces. This is the part that most people don't love because it's not fun. However, it, again, is worth it in my opinion because of the final result. And really this part only takes a few minutes. So all of these pieces that I'm pulling out, I'm putting the backing in the garbage. I lift it up and I tilt it into the light to see if there's any pieces that I have missing. If there's any pieces that are missing, obviously at this point you can take them and pull them out. Then I use my spoon to kind of pour that glitter over that backing. So this glitter is really only going to stick to the sticky part of the tape. It's going to stick on the tape backing only with static, but we're going to take that off in a minute. I have some tape backing here that I saved from a previous project, and I'm just using that to burnish that glitter in place. That flattens that glitter, but it makes it really, really sparkly. It makes it have some good contact with the adhesive. And I definitely don't want to not use that step because it's going to make it really sparkle. Then I have two colored Copic markers here. I have a YG67 for my greenery and my leaves, and I have a V17 for my flowers. The only other Copic marker I'm using here is the Copic blender pen. So I use that green pen and put the spot of color where I want it to be darkest on my leaves and on my stems. Then I go with that blender pen and blend that color out. Now, again, you could, if you want, use multiple colors here for the Copic marker. It's not necessary because we're using that blending pen to rehydrate that ink to spread it out. We're going to get some color variation from this. It works really, really quickly. The one thing you want to make sure to do is when I go to change my colors from the green to the purple, I want to make sure to use a scrap piece of paper and make sure I don't have any of that green ink left on my Copic blender pen. Now, when I first learned this technique, I was told that you can do this with dye-based markers as well, and technically you can. However, it ruins your marker a lot quicker because of the texture of the glitter. It doesn't ruin your Copic marker. I've never had this ruin a Copic marker. I might get some glitter on the end of my Copic marker, but it's never ruined a tip because the tips are a lot better quality. You can also replace a tip if by chance you need to. The second thing is, alcohol ink will dry on non-porous surfaces, and that glitter is a non-porous surface. So when I first learned that you could do this with dye-based markers, I tried it. I did one with a Copic marker or Copic markers, and I did one with dye-based markers. The Copic markers stayed the true color and dried really quickly. The dye-based markers, for weeks, I could pick up color off of that glitter because it won't dry on that glitter. The color faded as I was picking it up. So I would not do this with dye-based markers. Technically you can, however, that color is never going to dry on the glitter. Once you have all of your pieces colored here, and the technique for the purple is exactly the same as the green, I put the dark color where I wanted it on my flower and then use the blender pen in order to pull that color out and blend it out. So we have darker to lighter for the flowers as well. The darker is in the center of those flowers. Then I can take the backing off of the background of that egg, pour the glitter on here, and technically if you wanted, you could use a Copic color to color that background of the egg. It's going to be a lot harder because of the areas of the greenery and the flowers, and I don't want to. I want to leave that background white because I just think it's really pretty with the color of those flowers on here. Now remember with that last card how we have little dots on the background of this? I didn't bother taking them off with the backing because I don't want to touch that tape. Anytime you touch it with your fingers, it changes the way the glitter sticks to it. So I put the glitter on there first. I burnished it to make sure that that glitter flattened and went really sparkly. Then I went and I took my tweezers to pull out all of those dots. So for this card, we don't have those dots all over the backing because it has that same glitter on it. But look at the result. It just is stunning, especially in person. The video never ever does anything justice, in my opinion, especially something like this. But that entire surface of that egg is glittered. But we just have the color from that Copic marker that we did while the backing was still on the adhesive for the background of that egg. So I'm going to glue this to the front of my card here. Once I have it glued to the front of the card, I want to use the same gems that I used for the last card for the centers of the flowers. Those will stick just fine to the centers of the flowers because they have the adhesive on there. I chose one of the sentiments from the beginning that I did my stamping and embossing on, and I'm going to choose the Aura gems because they have that yellow gold tone to them, and it's going to coordinate with the gold embossing from that sentiment. So once again, I'm going to use my tool-in-one. I'm going to pierce the adhesive on the back of those gems. Here's the color difference between those two gems there. I don't think the Spectrum ones would have as much impact on the purple flowers as the yellow do for the centers. So the great thing about those essential gems is they come in 4 different sizes. So when I'm putting them on my pieces, I pick and choose which size is best. So I use the largest size for the larger flowers. Then I chose the next size down for the smaller flowers. And then I chose the next size down from that for the smallest of the flowers. So we have a little bit of size variation from those as well. Now, I went and put that glitter on the dots on the background of the card. If you wanted, you could have left the adhesive on there, pulled them off at this point and put the other gems on there like we did the last card, but I don't think it needs it because we have that glitter sparkle all over the background. In my opinion, I think just the gems in the center of the flowers is the perfect touch. And just like the last card, it stands really, really nicely because we shaved that tiny little bit off of the back of the card. But it's a fun and unique card to send to someone for Easter. And with that glitter, it just has an amazing wow factor to it. And I forgot to mention, I did that in microfine glitter. You can do it in regular glitter as well, but I think the microfine has a lot more sparkle to it and looks a lot nicer in the end. Then we have the second card that we did, the paper piecing with the ink blending, and then our bunny with the eggs in the background, which has a ton of texture between that velvet cardstock, the embossing, and the color shift ink. Then we have our very first 2 egg backgrounds. This one, like I said before, is my favorite. It's just a little bit more subtle. To me, this one just says spring just a little bit more. It just has the embossing and then just the solid colored eggs. As well, we have our very first one with that black done first, and then those color shift inks blended together to create some really bright, vibrant, colorful eggs. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.